So today we're going over the complete guide for Occultist, extracting imprinting aspects, crafting nightmare sigils, and enchanting armor and weapons. If you have any specific question, check the description down below for a specific timestamp. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now, in order to imprint aspects, we must first have a legendary aspect, and that requires us to extract it or get it from the Codex of Power. In order to extract a legendary aspect, we must first have a legendary item in our inventory or on our character. We can go ahead and click and drag it into this slot here, or right click it, and we will get a legendary aspect equivalent to whatever legendary power is on that legendary. So if it's a high roll, it'll remain a high roll. If it's a low roll, it'll remain a low roll. It will not change between this process. If we go ahead and extract this aspect, we will destroy the legendary item, so make sure it's something that you don't care about. You'll also note that the lower level legendary items require less gold and less resources compared to the higher level legendary items to extract. After we go ahead and click the extract aspect button, we will go ahead and find this legendary aspect in our aspects tab of our inventory. We can actually place these in the stash if you get too many. There are also 4 different types of legendary aspects: defensive, offensive, utility, and resource. These 4 only have a small subsection of gear that they can be applied to. For example, the offensive one can only be applied to the weapons, gloves, and jewelry, but the resource ones can only be applied to rings. This is very important to note because it really determines where you want your aspects placed in your build. After we've acquired a legendary aspect, we can go ahead and imprint it onto another legendary or rare item. You cannot imprint it onto a unique item, which you will get later on in the game. So if I have this crossbow here and I wanted to imprint an aspect, then actually I'll do the boots here. Then I will go ahead and select that boot and select a legendary aspect from my inventory that the aspect can slot into. For example, the boots, you're going to need a utility aspect, for example. These aspects, when you want to imprint them, cost a multitude of different resources depending on what you're imprinting on. For example, the jewelry will require abstruse sigils and veiled crystals. The gloves will require coiling wards and veiled crystals. The boots will require veiled crystals and coiling wards. Depending on what thing you're imprinting, it will change. I believe the weapons remain a little bit different as well. You'll need baleful fragments. So if I want to go back to this boot here and imprint this utility aspect, I can go ahead and straight up hit imprint. Pretty simple. Very, very easy to go ahead and do so. Now, I can also just constantly re-imprint on that same legendary item if I want to. I also don't necessarily need a legendary aspect that I had extracted because I can use the Codex of Power. These legendary aspects are located in all the different dungeons in the game. When you complete them for the first time, you will unlock them. These Codexes of Power legendary aspects can be used infinitely, but will always give you the minimum roll of potentially a various stat range. So this is core to the leveling process, but in the end game, we're probably not going to be using this all that much. One last thing, if you wish to extract a legendary aspect, you can only do so once on a specific aspect. For example, you can see these boots, which I just imprinted, can no longer be extracted again. So if you plan on imprinting an aspect, make sure that it's not something that you wish to use again later on if you decide to replace it. Now let's talk crafting and salvaging nightmare sigils. Now I unlock these tabs after completing a couple of nightmare dungeons, which seems to be how you unlock this. The first tab is salvaging sigils here. This one is pretty straightforward. Before we get to crafting one, we kind of want to get some sort of resource, and you're going to get the sigil powder, which is the resource needed to craft it, either from doing various content in the game, including things like just going through and completing nightmare dungeons, or salvaging your previous acquired nightmare sigils, which you will get from doing dungeons or higher world tiers in general, and oftentimes in your grand caches from the Tree of Whispers. Now, when you go ahead and salvage them, they are based upon the tier. For example, if I salvage a tier 7 one or a tier 8 one, I'm going to get 2. If I salvage a tier 1 or tier 2, I'm still going to get 2. But as you raise higher and higher, and if I were to craft one for you, like a tier 80 one, I can go ahead and salvage that one for way higher sigil powder. So the higher tier ones are going to give you higher sigil powder. The sacred ones are going to be 1 to 20, and the ancestral ones are going to be 21 to 100, which will also be reflected in the crafting tab. Now, crafting is pretty straightforward. You'll see the Nightmare Sigil, you'll see what tier it can potentially be created at, and the amount of afflictions or affixes that you'll get according to that. The sigil powder cost increases as you go higher in the tiers, and on top of all that, this is not guaranteed to be a specific tier. It will be a range always. So if I were to craft, let's say, 5 of these tier 1 to 5s, you'll note here that this one is tier 5, this one's tier 3, tier 1, tier 1, tier 4. So it's completely random in that range. So oftentimes you're going to want to craft a specific Nightmare Sigil according to the tier that you're looking to finish. These will also be random in terms of the dungeons that you will be able to run. So for example, here we have Crusader's Cathedral, Shadowed Plunge, Ghoulren Slums. There's a limited amount of dungeons that you will be able to acquire Nightmare Sigils for. However, you will always get a random one according to the ones you craft. Lastly, let's talk Enchanting. Now, Enchanting is basically re-rolling a certain affix of one of your gear pieces. It costs quite a bit of resources, and in fact, oftentimes you're not going to be able to acquire these resources relatively easily as you approach later on in the game. Now, if I put in, let's say, a lower level item, I only have to use lower level crafting materials, but the higher level items you go, the higher level crafting materials you need. For example, here I have this glove, and you can see it's got 4 different substats on it. Now, these substats, I am not 100% sure on the availability of substats per piece of gear, and once we get a chart of that as the game starts to come out, hopefully I'll be able to update that and put it in the description down below. But if I wish to reroll one of these stats, I can pick any one of these 4, and then it just rerolls it for me into the availability of stats available on that piece of gear. For example, let's say I don't really care about willpower. I can go ahead and enchant it. The important thing to note is that this will be untradeable, which it is somewhat tradable, and also it will only be able to reroll that specific stat. So if I choose willpower here, I will not be able to reroll Twisting Blades after or Lucky Hit Chance. I can only reroll 1 stat per gear. So let's go ahead and reroll it. And what will happen is you'll see 2 additional substats appear and a no change, but you're still not going to have the resources after you pick the no change. So you can see here, let's say I want attack speed. Okay, great. Now you'll notice that I have that attack speed, but I can also enchant it a second time. So we can go ahead and do it again. Boom, critical strike chance, which is actually an incredibly good stat. What you'll also notice is that the enchant cost increases every single time. So if I were to go ahead and continue to enchant, you can see the cost associated with enchanting increases and increases and increases. So you really don't want to do this a ton of times. You only want to do it a few times. Of course, the min-maxing later on in the game, you're going to be rerolling all the time. So you will have to increase the cost.